If you are drafting players in fantasy football in hopes that they can finish exactly where you drafted them at, then you and I just have a fundamental disagreement on how to draft in fantasy football. I'm looking to draft guys who can do more than just return on my investment in drafts. So if you want to see the players who I don't believe have much upside to finish past their ADP, make sure to drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel to show your support, because I'm getting into the worst picks I'm seeing in 2025 drafts already. So to start out with these first two guys, I want to get them out of the way because I've already discussed them. Tyreek Hill and T. Higgins. So let me get into Tyreek Hill, just in case you have not seen me already talk about Tyreek Hill in previous videos. Tyreek Hill is one of my least favorite picks right now. He has a wide receiver 15 price point. It is 27.5 overall in ADP on Underdog Best Ball drafts. Now, the first thing that I will say with this one is Tyreek Hill is actively dropping in ADP. Maybe it's because people looked and saw that Tyreek Hill is coming off another surgery to that wrist already in like May. So the early word is that maybe he's going to be ready for training camp. It doesn't look like he should be not there for training camp. Or maybe it's because people saw me talking about him and how you should not draft him. Because I went through really extensive research right here that shows you why you should not draft Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill is part of research that I've done for over the past 10 years. And what I was essentially researching here was wide receivers who went on a consecutive run of top 12 finishes in fantasy football in a half PPR format. So as you can see on the list on the screen right here, you can see a bunch of big name guys, right? Antonio Brown, Julio Jones, they went on 6 consecutive seasons of top 12 finishes in fantasy football. That's the peak number right there, by the way. Then you can look at Tyreek Hill. Now, what you can see with him is that his first initial run was only 2 years. It was from 2017 to 2019, and the reason that it ended was because of a shortened season. Well, then he returned to the top 12, went on another run of 4 consecutive seasons. So what does that total up to? That totals up to 6 seasons as a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy football. And some of the biggest takeaways that you need to take into account from this research that I did right here, you could see them at the bottom right there. 1 out of 3 of the top guys returned when their run ended at the age of 30 or after the age of 30. So essentially, if you were at the age of 30 or just past it and your run ended already, it was unlikely that you were going to get there again. And nobody has ever gone for a third consecutive run. Nobody has ever started a third run. So Tyreek Hill would literally be breaking history right here. And again, I'm not trying to tell you that Tyreek Hill is not a Hall of Fame talent or anything like that. Tyreek Hill, though, at his draft position, at wide receiver 15, the chances that he actually finishes above where you draft him are very, very slim. You could obviously say, yes, it's a quarterback issue with Tua. Yes, it's because he was injured. Well, number one, he's got the same quarterback issue if that was the issue with Tua right there. And number two, if Tyreek Hill's injury was the main cause for concern in 2024, well, you can look at other guys on this list who had issues with shortened seasons and never were the same player. DeAndre Hopkins never was the same. Odell Beckham Jr. never was the same. These kind of guys had injuries that just derailed their careers. This looks like it absolutely could be the case for Tyreek Hill. You got to stay away from Tyreek Hill. And then when we go to T. Higgins right here, T. Higgins is also one of the craziest picks right now in drafts. I don't understand this one. He's drafted as the wide receiver 12, 23.4 ADP in underdog drafts. T. Higgins is in a spot where it makes no sense to draft him in underdog drafts. Because let's just address one of the main things that, again, I've gone over T. Higgins in a different video already this offseason. But if you did not see it, let's just go ahead and start with what T. Higgins has done throughout his career in fantasy football. You can see on the screen that his best finish was a top 17 wide receiver finish. And look at the numbers that always were there. What he's getting on a year-by-year basis, targets-wise, is exactly the same number. So essentially, in order for him to get a top 15 finish, he's going to have to be extraordinarily efficient on every touch, unlike he's ever been in the past. And I went through this research on this video where I discussed him a couple videos prior. This research was going through the top 12 wide receivers in fantasy football that basically had a breakthrough season and what happened to their volume the following season and if they returned to the top 12. So again, this is a long list. We're not going to go through every single guy on this list right here, but essentially what you can take away from this list is that these wide receivers, a good chunk of them who lost volume, did not return. Now there's a lot of other factors here, and T. Higgins, again, has never been a top 12 guy. But what we're doing is we're drafting him as a top 12 guy, almost like we're expecting him to gain volume with Jamar Chase still as the wide receiver 1. Explain that to me. That makes no sense whatsoever, to expect T. Higgins to gain volume. And if you're not expecting him to gain volume, you're expecting him to be unbelievably efficient on every single touch that he gets. It's not realistic here. I love T. Higgins. I loved drafting him last year because his price was so much more affordable. He was being valued as a low-end wide receiver 2 or a high-end wide receiver 3. This year, it's so much different. He's a low-end wide receiver 1 / high-end wide receiver 2 in drafts, and he has never done it, and he will not do it this year. Avoid T. Higgins. Now, the next guy that I want to get into here, you have not heard me talk about. You're going to hear me go on a string of guys here, and I want to start with TJ Hockenson. TJ Hockenson of the Minnesota Vikings, tight end 5 on Underdog, 85.1 ADP on Underdog. Now, TJ Hockenson, I hate this pick for so many reasons. This is one of my least favorite picks easily. You take out those top 2. Tight end 5, 85 ADP on Underdog. I wanted to reiterate that because once we go through what I'm going to go through, it's going to sound insane. So essentially what I did a couple of years ago was I went through the top tight ends in every season in fantasy football. And essentially what I always found was that the top tight ends in fantasy were always breaking 160 fantasy points in a fantasy season. The most amount of tight ends that would do that in a particular year would be about 6 tight ends at most. And along with that research, I was kind of going through all the list of guys who just kept popping up and recurring as great tight ends in fantasy football. And of course, it's names that you would expect to be on there. Travis Kelce has had 8 top 5 tight end finishes. That's a ridiculous number right there. Rob Gronkowski, he's had 5. Mark Andrews has even had 5. George Kittle, he's had 5. Then you've got to see 2 guys on this list right here that you could see on the screen that I think are really interesting names. Evan Ingram, who's had 2, and then you've got TJ Hockenson, who's had 3. Now, you can look at the difference between Evan Ingram and TJ Hockenson's careers, and you could definitely draw the conclusion that TJ Hockenson is an overall better fantasy player than Evan Ingram. I would back that claim up because if you actually look at TJ Hockenson's career, basically the only time he's been outside the top 5 tight ends is when he had an injury-shortened season. Whereas with Evan Ingram, he was kind of a late bloomer who just kind of started to hit his stride. Now he's on a new team and is being priced way lower, by the way, who we'll go through here in a minute. But the point I'm trying to make here is that with Evan Ingram having 2 finishes inside the top 5, TJ Hockenson's had 3 finishes inside the top 5. He will be 28 years old by the start of this new season. So essentially what we're looking at here is he going to kind of leap towards the George Kittle territory, the Mark Andrews territory? I'm going to tell you why it's not going to happen. Because when you look at George Kittle and when you look at Mark Andrews, their situations with quarterbacks have been very similar throughout the years. Mark Andrews was an elite tight end for many years in fantasy because of Lamar Jackson. And Brock Purdy and Jimmy Garoppolo, say what you will about them, but they were good enough to give George Kittle the ball because they were a very tight end-centric offense. When you look at Minnesota, not only do you have quarterback issues, who I want to get to in a second, but you've also got lots of weapons for J.J. McCarthy to throw to. Justin Jefferson obviously is going to get tons of targets on a per-game basis. You will not mess with him. Jordan Addison is a great wide receiver too. Then you've got TJ Hockenson, who is a highly paid tight end in his own respects. But TJ Hockenson being potentially the number 3 target on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis maybe, with a new quarterback who we have never seen at the NFL level. TJ Hockenson is so overvalued. I just do not see him hitting this tight end 5 finish right here. And if you're drafting him as your tight end 5, you better hope he's going to do that because he's a top 100 draft pick. And again, circling back to Evan Ingram is in a way better position this year with a good quarterback on a good offense. And I'm not saying that Hockenson's offense isn't good in Minnesota, but Denver has way less target competition for Evan Ingram to compete in. Evan Ingram is so much cheaper in these drafts. You can see his price on the screen right now. And in my opinion, has way more advantages and way more possibilities to finish above where his ADP is. So if you do want to get in on drafting Evan Ingram today, you could go down in the comments. There's a link there to go to Underdog to sign up. You can use code FN to sign up for Underdog. They'll match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 in bonus credits when you use code FFN. And you can get in on one of these drafts, either the Best Ball Mania, the Puppy, or the Schnauzer right now, and deposit your money so you can get in one of those drafts, and they'll match that first deposit 50%. I won $19,000 playing Underdog Best Ball tournaments last year, so yes, give yourself a shot at the big money here. Now, getting into our next guy right here, I also really want to clear this one up immediately. A.J. Brown, I think, is a bad pick in fantasy football in 2025. Now, again, I want to make this very clear right out of the gate. I can actually see tons of upside with this pick. Like, it is not lost on me that A.J. Brown is going to have spike weeks in 2025. He's done it throughout his entire career. That's kind of A.J. Brown's specialty, is that he can go 35, 40 points in one week, and then kind of give you a 10 to 8 point game the very next week. A.J. Brown has always kind of had that type of playing style in the NFL. He's on one week, he's off the next. But overall, throughout his career, it's obviously served him very well for high-end finishes in fantasy football. Spike weeks are going to happen, but I think it's very unlikely that he's going to return his ADP this year, which is at 17 overall, and he's the wide receiver 10 off the board in Underdog drafts. So I want to go back to that research that I was showing you with Tyreek Hill and those wide receivers who went on their consecutive runs as a top 12 wide receiver. So if we look at A.J. Brown, he went on a 2 consecutive run as a top 12 wide receiver from 2022 to 2024. So it just ended his run. And again, the reason it ended, he did miss 4 games. Because if you actually look, you can see the numbers on the screen. He averaged more than 14 fantasy points per game. I'm not debating that he's still a really good wide receiver in fantasy football. But here's the problem that we also saw with A.J. Brown in 2024. A.J. Brown actually lost 2 targets per game in the span of one season. In 2023, he had 9.3 targets per game. And in 2024, he had 7.5 targets per game. That makes it so much harder for you to finish as a top 12 wide receiver, even if you did play all 17 games. And again, he probably would have been a top 12 guy had he played all 17 games. But A.J. Brown is at a disadvantage this year because it's still the same type of offense that they ended on last year. They are Saquon Barkley centric. It's not even a question. This will be one of the most highly volumized running teams in the NFL, and probably simultaneously will have one of the lower passing volumes in the NFL as well. And when you factor in Devonta Smith and a healthy Dallas Goedert, A.J. Brown is going to struggle to see enough target share for him to be a top 12 wide receiver. And again, you're drafting him as a wide receiver 10. I was really hoping that throughout the offseason, we were kind of going to see A.J. Brown's price drop. We haven't really seen that yet. So I'm not taking him right now. I'm not ruling out that I would take him at a wide receiver 13 or 14 price point. But right now, as a wide receiver 10, I don't think there's a really much of a shot that he finishes at or above his ADP right here. Now, getting into our next guy right here. He's been a huge hit over the last couple weeks. Tons of hype around George Pickens. And why not? Of course. He's a super talented wide receiver, gets traded to a much better situation. George Pickens is a guy, as a Steelers fan, I actually want to see do well in a better situation offensively. Now, George Pickens is the wide receiver 31 on Underdog, 56.6 ADP. Now, that price has drastically risen over the last 2 weeks, basically since he got traded to Dallas. And honestly, I could even see it rise up a couple more points. Now, you can easily hold his feet to the fire on this one statistic alone, which is that he's only been a top 30 wide receiver one time. And again, that's really easy to pick on him with. I'm actually not going to hold his feet to the fire this one, because if you know anything about the Steelers, they suck offensively. They are one of the worst treasure troves or dumpster fires for wide receivers in fantasy football post Ben Roethlisberger. It is a disaster. Now, here's the reason that everybody's so excited about this one. He's going to Dallas, which has a much better quarterback situation, and he's also not really being asked to be a wide receiver one. He's going to be playing behind CeeDee Lamb, which of course is going to limit his target share, so people aren't pricing him as even close to wide receiver one, which I do think is appropriate. And he's also going to get tons of coverage not drawn towards him because it will be drawn away towards CeeDee Lamb. It will open up opportunities. But here's something that people just need to remember. Like I said, I'm a Steelers fan. I know the history, especially under Mike Tomlin, uncomfortable truth, of wide receivers in fantasy football. If you look at like the last 6 wide receivers who have left Pittsburgh, it has been a dumpster fire. Now, obviously, the one that people remember most because it just happened, it's recency bias with Deontay Johnson. Deontay Johnson, what he had, his previous year finish before he went to the Carolina Panthers was the wide receiver 43 in his last year in Pittsburgh. Then he gets traded over the offseason in 2024 to the Panthers. Actually does kind of well, but they can't stand the guy, so they go ahead and cut him. Then the Ravens go ahead and pick him up. He does nothing for a finish of wide receiver 86. Now again, that's the recent history right there. But let's go back in time and look at all the other wide receivers over the last several years that have left Pittsburgh and what their fantasy finish was the year they left Pittsburgh. Martavis Bryant, if you don't remember him, he was an electric wide receiver for the Steelers. He had some issues, outside of football, so he ended up getting suspended. He had a lot of issues. They traded him to the Oakland Raiders in 2018. Before they traded him, he was the wide receiver 49 in fantasy football. Then he goes to Oakland, wide receiver 123. Not great. Antonio Brown, obviously a legend. I love Antonio Brown. I know he's wild, but he's a great football player. Wide receiver 4, gets traded to Oakland, doesn't play it down for them, plays one game for the Patriots, wide receiver 180, 149 finish. Then he comes back in 2020, wide receiver 66. Juju Smith-Schuster leaves in 2022. He was not traded, but I did want to include Juju on this list because he actually had a better rise here. He was injured in his last season as a Steeler, wide receiver 137 finish. Goes to Kansas City, a much better situation. It still isn't that great. Wide receiver 29 here. Chase Claypool. Don't forget this one because this is an easy one to forget because of how bad he was. Wide receiver 37 in his last year in Pittsburgh. 2022, midseason, they traded him to the Chicago Bears. Wide receiver 71. Not good history here, to say the least. So let's just go out on a limb really quick. Let's say that George Pickens hits best case scenario with Dallas in 2025, which would be Juju Smith-Schuster out of all these guys. Wide receiver 29 finish. Being drafted as the wide receiver 31. There's not much upside there. So I hate to be the wet blanket. Like I said, I actually am rooting for George Pickens as a Steelers fan. I think he's a great player. I think the Steelers suck offensively. I believe Mike Tomlin is screwing up talent in Pittsburgh right now. But I do believe that history against the wide receivers out of Pittsburgh is not great. And I'm very weary of drafting George Pickens because I just don't see much upside for him to finish above this price. And our last guy that I want to go through today, this is also going to catch people off guard. I've got Drake May. I do not like Drake May in 2025 fantasy football. He's the quarterback 16, 123.5 ADP. So it's not like he's super expensive or anything like that, right? And I get it. I am definitely going to get some pushback with this one in particular here because Drake May is obviously in a much better situation in 2025 than he was in 2024. Much better head coach, theoretically better weapons, theoretically better offensive line. Everything should be in place for him to take a sophomore leap. But Mike Vrabel while I do like him as a coach, there's a lot of history here that needs to be addressed from a fantasy football perspective when it comes to his quarterbacks. So obviously, when he was with Tennessee, Ryan Tannehill was his quarterback in Tennessee. Now, Ryan Tannehill had 2 top 12 seasons as a quarterback in fantasy under Mike Vrabel. Now, again, that's like one of those situations where you could be like, well, Ryan Tannehill is nowhere near the talent of Drake May. And I would agree with you on that. He is nowhere near the talent that Drake May is, absolutely. So I will hear you out on that argument. But I will also just say, I'm sorry, you're flat out wrong. Unfortunately, you are wrong. Because this is a coaching philosophy with Mike Vrabel here. Because let's look at every single season that he was the head coach at Tennessee, what they did with their pass attempts, how many pass attempts they threw on a yearly basis, and where that ranked in the league. So 2018, 437 pass attempts, 31st in the league, almost dead last. 2019, 448 pass attempts, 31st. Keep in mind, that was the year they drafted A.J. Brown, and he was an immediate hit right out of the gate. 2020, 485 passing yards, 30th in the league. So second year of A.J. Brown was a stud that year as well. They still were in the bottom 3 teams of NFL pass attempts. That's just not good. 2021 was actually their outlier season. They had 535 pass attempts for 25th in the league. But that was also the year that Derrick Henry missed basically more than half the season with an injury. So they kind of had to take some more chances offensively because their main weapon, which Mike Vrabel loves, the run game, was completely obliterated when Derrick Henry left. Then in 2022, when Derrick Henry was back, went right back to how it used to be. 456 total pass attempts, 30th in the league. And then this last season in Tennessee, 494 pass attempts, 30th in the league. Again, we can make the argument, we can have the discussion. Was that because Ryan Tannehill is just not that great of a quarterback? I don't think he was that great of a quarterback. And I do think Drake May is a better quarterback and will be a better quarterback than Ryan Tannehill. But in fantasy football, that's a problem here. So is this going to change? I'm going to tell you it's not. It's not going to change. Look at their draft moves that they just made. Look at their draft moves and tell me if you think it's going to change. They drafted Travion Henderson in the second round, and they said they view him as a 3-down back. And even if he's not, they still have Ramondre Stevenson to carry the ball. So they're going to be a run-first team. And by the way, they improved the offensive line as well to run the football. This is Mike Vrabel. That's who he is. He wants to run the football. It's going to be very similar to the Jim Harbaugh approach in Los Angeles and the absolute drastic difference that we saw from the Chargers offense within a 1-year span when Jim Harbaugh got there. Now, let's look at Justin Herbert because I do believe that this is actually Drake May's upside this year. Justin Herbert was the quarterback 12 in 2024. Now, if you're looking at where you're drafting Drake May right now as the quarterback 16, that should be viewed as a W right there. And I would actually agree to a certain extent right here. If he was not going around this group of quarterbacks, look at the quarterbacks that are going around him. Jared Goff, quarterback 13, definitely has upside to be a top 10 quarterback. Dak Prescott, while a lot of people don't like him, has upside to be a top 10 quarterback. Quarterback 14. Jordan Love, quarterback 17, has top 5 upside that we saw the year that he started. So if he was not surrounded by guys that are in better offensive situations than him, with better weapons, I would say, actually, I think Drake May is a good pick. But where he's going right now, it's actually just not a good move based on all the other upside that there is around Drake May. So let me know what players you are just off of right now in 2025. And if you want to see the top 30 running back rankings for 2025, click on this video right here.